It's known as Special K, a psychedelic drug popular in dance clubs and highly addictive.
One UCSD physician says he is getting remarkable results using a hallucinogenic party drug known on the street as Special K.
Special K is a nickname for ketamine. Long before it was known as a party drug, though, ketamine was used as an anesthetic. It's on the World Health Organization's list of essential medications.
It may be the solution to chronic pain, depression, even suicidal thoughts. Ketamine, a new treatment some are now turning to instead of opioids or antidepressants.
But doctors say this same drug, ketamine, approved as animal tranquilizer and anesthetic, can also be a lifesaver when used to treat severe depression when nothing else works.
911, what is the address of the emergency?
He's walking south on Billing Street and he has a mask on.
Okay. Were any weapons involved or mentioned?
No.
On August 24th, 2019, Elijah McLean was walking home from a convenience store when the cops showed up and told him to stop. They needed to talk to him. Someone had called the police and said he was wearing a ski mask, waving his arms, and that he, quote, looked sketchy.
Hey, stop right there. Stop. 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 I have a right to stop you because you're being
Elijah
suspicious.
didn't know what to do. It's odd. You never get used to the intrusion that often comes with police encounters, the pat-downs, the manipulative talk meant to get you to say something incriminating, the pushy attitude. It's all off-putting, even if you've been arrested dozens of times. But McLean hadn't been arrested dozens of times, and he was someone who didn't do well with people putting their hands on him, which he repeatedly explained to the officers. I'm an introvert, he said. Please respect my boundaries. Leave me alone. But the police weren't listening. They went hands-on with him, which is just cop speak for we took him down. So Elijah winds up on the ground, face in the dirt, hands cuffed behind his back. And just like you'd expect, just like we saw in the George Floyd case, it was all excused with a broad, vague claim made by an arresting officer on scene, saying he was probably just high.
Whatever he's on, he has incredible strength.
Yeah, crazy strength.
Now you probably know how this story ends. The medics show up and they claim that Elijah's freaking out, so they give him a shot of ketamine. He stopped breathing on the way to the hospital, and 4 days later, he was declared dead and taken off of life support. The world didn't hear about that story until the next year, when George Floyd was killed by police officers, and everyone started looking into back cases where black men had been killed by the police with little oversight. That's when McLean's name made headlines, and the police department finally began to get a flood of emails and phone calls demanding that the case be reinvestigated. It was suddenly a huge deal. This is the reason I got into communication. It's incredible what happens when the right people start talking about something. We live in a world that's more media-oriented every year. Sometimes that's a bad thing, like when we all come to believe stuff that isn't true about prison or faraway cultures because we see it on TV. But other times, that's a great thing, because it forces people who want to bury a story to instead seek justice. So along with the spotlight on the Aurora Police Department, a lot of people also wanted to know about the ketamine Elijah was forcibly given. What's up with that? At the time, ketamine was a drug that a lot of us hadn't even heard of. Or maybe we'd seen a sign or a billboard advertising it as a new form of treatment for medication-resistant depression. But we really weren't sure what it was. Lots of folks wondered if ketamine was to blame for Elijah's death. We wondered why it was administered in the first place. And after all of that, we wondered if any police officers would be held accountable. As you might expect, police unions being what they are, those who stood to benefit by blaming Elijah's death on ketamine came out of the woodwork. Mostly law enforcement who wanted to skip all the interactions before the paramedics showed up and just start with the ketamine, like it was injected in a blind placebo study in a lab somewhere. Others just saw another opportunity to talk shit about drugs and ramp up the war. And I found myself thinking back to my experiences with ketamine as a kid, and how it was presented in a very similar light to what I was seeing once again on TV. Dangerous, damaging, deadly even. But how could they use that old trope if the medication had been administered by medics? Talk about walking a tightrope. So today's episode is about ketamine, a drug which is oddly odd. It's not exactly like a traditional anesthetic, or a traditional antidepressant, or a traditional recreational drug, yet it serves all three purposes every day in the United States, often in new legal facilities where doctors give intravenous doses to patients who are too high to talk until it wears off. It's hardly what we traditionally think of when we're talking about a therapeutic drug. But we can't talk about ketamine without first talking about a drug called phencyclidine, which started to be used in medicine as an anesthetic in 1958. You probably know this drug better by its fearful nicknames, PCP or angel dust.
For months, drug officials have been warning about the dangers of the chemical PCP, an hallucinogenic drug popular particularly with the young. But the House Narcotics Committee heard today that more than 14% of the population between the ages of 18 and 25 has used it at least once, and that its use is on the upswing.
As a kid, I was taught that PCP would make me psychotic, that it would give me superhuman strength, and that I would think I was bulletproof if I took it, or maybe I'd jump off a bridge thinking I could fly. Talk about miseducation. You know, there's always been a drug or two which the government hates at any given time, and they use those drugs to reflect and soak up all of our cultural fears about race, about poverty, about sexual identity. Plus, we have no shortage of media which appears to prove those fears are justified. It's what the mainstream is composed of. Here's one cops clip that made the rounds for decades after it premiered in the early 1990s, when I was still a formidable kid.
Apparently there's a naked man in a park, and he's bleeding pretty bad from his head, and kind of being violent.
A man is sitting in someone's yard, naked and covered in blood. And he's out of it, because that's what PCP does when you start to come down. You're kind of there, but you're not there, and confused as all hell, which means often you're very afraid. I'll get to why that's the case shortly, but the cops show up because in the United States, we use the police for all sorts of stuff that they shouldn't be involved in. And of course, the guy freaks out even more because now armed uniformed police officers are charging him amidst an already confusing situation. So he gets up and starts walking, then stops and stares at a privacy fence for a few seconds before punching a hole in it. The cops catch him as he's trying to crawl through. Eventually they get him to the ground and arrested, and voila, I learned what PCP is and what it feels like to use it. And boy was I wrong. I found that out a few years later when I tried it and wasn't all that impressed with the drug, but was blown away by the false narratives created by mainstream media and governmental voices. And I was pissed off about that scene in Cops, where the people we pay to serve and protect this guy had no idea what to do when he was simply coming down off a drug that he didn't adequately prepare for. Those gloomy, freaked out, dead-eyed side effects that come from PCP wearing off, they were also a problem in hospital settings when PCP was first being used for surgery way back when. Patients would flip out when they came to, and since it took so long to wear off, they would keep freaking out, and it would be difficult to hold them down, fight or flight being what it is. So chemists got to work trying to find a better version of the drug, one without so many awful side effects. They created more than 200 derivatives of PCP. Many of them produced effects somewhat similar to the original drug, but one seemed to work a bit better than the rest, C1581. It was first marketed as Ketalar in 1962, then used on U.S. soldiers during the Vietnam War, and finally released for civilian use in 1970. By the 1990s, my friends and I were taking it as a drug called Special K, and we were told that it was animal tranquilizer because it was often stocked in veterinary clinics. The PCP fear that once surrounded this drug seemed to rapidly disappear the second ketamine looked like it might be marketable in legal clinics. The biggest difference between the two drugs comes down to little more than the time it takes to wear off. Whereas the effects I'll get into shortly last a few minutes with ketamine, and even when given intravenously, it can be withdrawn and patients will begin to sober up almost immediately, those same effects last a long time with PCP, especially if someone takes a large dose. But the real reason our fear disappeared when PCP became ketamine had to do with who was producing it and who was buying it. PCP picked up popularity in underground markets throughout the 1970s and on into the 90s. It was consumed by mostly poor people who were looking for a cheap kick to add to tobacco, so associating it with crime and mayhem just made sense. When I was a kid, people would smoke it on cigarettes. They called it embalming fluid. I only smoked PCP a few times myself, and maybe I just didn't hit it hard enough, but I really didn't get it. It was like acid without the trip, or Xanax without the missing day. I wasn't sure what to appreciate about it, except that I did have a wonky, head-bendy feeling for a few seconds after a big hit, and then a big hangover. Anyway, my point is that since pharmaceutical companies would be in charge of manufacturing ketamine, that fear-mongering suddenly had to go elsewhere, to drugs like crack, and later street-sold fentanyls. Ketamine was for rich, bougie, mostly white folks, so fearing it was silly in a country that tends to save that fear for poor folks or people of color. So what do these drugs do? I talked briefly a few weeks ago about glutamate, and as always, I attempted to avoid technical jargon and confusing terminology because I'm not a neuroscientist, and this show is not about medical advice. There's a gap between those who understand neuroscience and those of us who don't speak that language. Even though a lot of what goes on in our brain and our bodies is actually pretty simple to understand, as long as it isn't up-translated into egghead speak. That gap is a big problem. The language adopted by those who are labeled professionals is often impossible to use with the people who need to know it. That's the other reason I got into communication. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to talk about glutamate again today, specifically the NMDA receptor site, which I discussed a few weeks ago in reference to nitrous oxide, aka whippets. Since that episode aired, I've received a few emails from listeners who thought that I didn't give glutamate enough of a description. I said that NMDA receptor site is where glutamate binds, and that's true, but it's not the only place where glutamate binds. The same neurons that have NMDA receptors usually also have AMPA receptors, and AMPA receptors are actually easier to activate with glutamate than NMDA receptors are. Already, we're at the limit of non-technical talk, so instead of getting in over my head, I'll try to super simplify things. Our brains have a bunch of chemicals floating around in them, some negatively charged, some positively charged, and some super positively charged. Sodium, magnesium, and potassium all carry a positive charge. Chloride has a negative charge, and calcium actually has a double positive charge. That's important to remember. Calcium does more than just bump up the voltage in the neuron, but it does bump up the voltage more than other ions. That means that anytime calcium comes flooding into a neuron, it's probably going to fire. Remember, neurons fire electrical impulses all at once. They aren't dimmer switches, they're buttons that totally discharge everything in a single bolt. They tend to remain at or below what's called resting potential. That's around negative 70 millivolts. But if that goes up just 15 millivolts to negative 55, a process begins whereby they rapidly charge way up and then discharge before returning to resting state. That's how the electrical signal moves down the chain of neurons. And as weird as it might seem, that's all we are. Massive webs of neurons that fire in particular patterns which feel like memories or urges or emotions. A lot of brain activity is just a result of things that happen to make certain chemicals either flow into or out of neurons, thereby raising or lowering the voltage and either passing signals on or silencing them. Again, super simplified, non-neuroscience description. But for our purposes, that's enough to understand the difference between NMDA receptors and AMPA, AMPA receptors. AMPA receptors only require a small bit of glutamate to fire, whereas NMDA receptors require a lot more encouragement from both glutamate outside the neuron, in the synaptic space between two neurons, but also a lot of times from inside the neuron. Now that encouragement from inside the neuron actually comes from the action of our friend the AMPA receptor, which works to open the NMDA receptor from the inside. And when NMDA receptor sites open, calcium, that rapid increaser with a double positive charge, it can flow into the neuron, allowing it to fire much more rapidly. Glutamate, which I described being disrupted by nitrous oxide last week, is responsible for what are considered excitatory neural responses, because glutamate activates neurons which make us remember something, or do something, or feel a certain way. It's the most common neurotransmitter in the body. Now here's where it gets interesting. When we fire the same neurons over and over, we produce something we call a memory, or in neurological speak, synaptic enhancement. That familiar feeling that comes from recalling something or someone is the result of additional AMPA cells forming on the outer edge of the neuron in response to it being frequently fired. And usually it's a pattern of neurons that go through this process all together, not just a single neuron, and that pattern forms the memory of an event. In other words, when you fire a specific pattern in your brain, say remembering your mother's face or your favorite place to eat, you actually recall those memories by recognizing which neural pathways feel right. And the reason they feel right has to do with those extra receptor sites that show up, making it easier for glutamate to work its magic from the inside and quickly and familiarly open NMDA calcium channels in the future, thereby rapidly firing the neuron and tellingly also creating even more AMPA receptors on the outside of the synapse. So the next time, the neuron fires even faster. It's a pretty cool process. All that to pave the way for ketamine, which disrupts normal glutamate action on the NMDA receptor sites, among other things. First things first, when we talk about ketamine, we're actually talking about a mixture of two different types of ketamine. At the risk of getting technical again, I should briefly mention enantiomers. Human hands are a good example of enantiomers. They're usually the same size and shape, but you can't lay one on top of the other and line them up, even if you rotate them. They are flip images of each other, mirror reflections of the same thing, shaped the same, yet also different. Now chemicals also have these properties, and when two molecules mirror one another in the same way as two hands, they're called enantiomers. Ketamine's enantiomers are called S-ketamine and R-ketamine. And when mixed together into a single formula, the combination of two enantiomers is called a racemic. That's what you're getting at your doctor's office in injections, and probably on the street if you're buying ketamine. A newer drug called Spravato, which is only S-ketamine, was recently released in a nasal spray, but it has to be administered in your doctor's office. So even though the two molecules look alike, like your hands, they have different properties that make them do different things inside our bodies. And it's only been recently that researchers have started to unpack the sometimes subtle differences. There's still a lot of work to do here, but this is where we're at right now. S-ketamine has a 4 times higher affinity for NMDA receptors, and it works around 4 times better as an anesthetic, meaning it's really good for surgery or for rendering someone unconscious. Because of this, researchers long thought that S-ketamine was the more effective of the two drugs for depression, although that's recently been challenged and studies are still underway to understand why sometimes R-ketamine appears to be much more effective for the therapeutic application. We actually don't know a ton about humans and R-ketamine alone yet, but R-ketamine does have a longer-lasting antidepressant effect than S-ketamine in animal studies. So even though both forms of the drug work equally well to get rid of depression rapidly, R-ketamine appears to do a better job of still working 4 days later. That's why most researchers currently believe that the mixture works better than S-ketamine or R-ketamine alone. S-ketamine kicks in fast, and R-ketamine keeps going. But again, we still have decades of research that's going to come in on this, so all of this is relatively preliminary. If you buy ketamine on the street, you're probably taking it orally or nasally, or maybe intravenously, but probably not in an IV drip. So instead of a steady high for 15 to 20 minutes, like you'll get at your doctor's office, With street drugs, you'll experience ups and downs if you shoot it or snort it, and a long, slow ride if you consume it orally. I always hesitate to promote the official expensive version of anything when other cheaper versions will work just as well. But in the case of ketamine, IV therapy in controlled long doses is actually the way to go. Ketamine's classified as a non-barbiturate dissociative anesthetic, which just means it's used in surgery, or at least that's where it was originally used. It's only been in recent decades that lower so-called therapeutic doses even started to be studied, although those of us who were using what we called Special K in the 90s and early 2000s were already well acquainted with the drug. When trying to explain what it feels like, it's hard to know which direction to go. I mean, it doesn't actually feel like anything. That's part of what's so creepy about it. It's not like an opioid painkiller where you don't feel pain and catch a buzz, but more like you just don't feel your body at all. It's kinda not there. Yet you can still feel. I used to pinch myself or tickle my arm to make sure. Here's a quote from the late great Terence McKenna, trying to get at this effect.
The first thing that happens after you've done ketamine is you cease to be concerned that you've done ketamine. Before there is any other effect, that effect takes hold. And that's a funny thing. I'm on these tryptamine hallucinogens, you are fully aware that you've taken a drug, that you're walking on eggshells, that you should keep yourself alert to what's going on, and in other words, it puts you on your toes. You know you're in a dimension of risk and opportunity, and you comport yourself that way. On ketamine, your definitions dissolve so completely that it's a major accomplishment to realize that you're a human being on a drug. You keep discovering and losing that realization. You keep saying, oh yes, that's what it is. I'm somebody and I'm stoned somewhere. And that's what this is. Now it's coming back to me.
Most of my friends who use it describe it exactly the same. I was addicted to Xanax for a few years in the late 1990s, and I took a lot. My friends would often joke that I was, quote, bricked out, because the big 2 milligram Xanax are shaped like bricks, and because, in their words, I would act like somebody had hit me in the head with a brick after 8 to 10 milligrams. Then I'd fall asleep for days and not realize any time had passed. That is, if I was lucky. Other times, I'd feel as if I'd been asleep, only to realize I'd been doing things the entire time. I once found my car buried deep in the woods on private property, wedged between 2 trees, and run all the way out of gas. I'd fallen asleep in it for a few hours, then walked home. But I didn't remember any of it aside from shadowy images through a glass darkly. I was dealing with a ton of psychological pain then, not very well I might add, and Xanax was a way to just sort of shut down, tune out, and forget about life. Literally. But Xanax is a tricky drug in high doses, because it often doesn't let you know that you're high. It's also a weird drug to take in super high doses if you're trying to get high for that same reason. It doesn't always get you high. Well, it always gets you high, but sometimes you're so oblivious to it that you just want to keep taking more because you don't really feel like you're high. But when you do feel it, in high doses, Xanax has that same kind of creepy, oily buzz that ketamine has. You kind of know you're high, but you're also lubed up, calm, and relaxed. And importantly, you're on your way up, and you can feel that. With ketamine, just like Xanax, that confidence and happiness usually melts into the confusion of taking too much, or of the drug kicking in all the way in the case of ketamine. Since it's an anesthetic when consumed in high doses, sometimes we wind up in what people have called a K-hole, a place that I actually enjoyed most times I've been there. It's someplace between consciousness and not. I imagine it's the last thing Michael Jackson felt when he took too much propofol. You're on a train to somewhere, and the closer you get, the more you lose track of what's going on around you. Fentanyl in high doses provides a similar sort of fuzzy, not always here feeling, but only for super brief periods. Some of us love it, others hate it. My wife says it makes her feel out of control, which I'm always like, yeah, that's kind of the point. So that's what ketamine was like for me. The point of that ramble is that even though it's hard to describe what ketamine feels like, because it doesn't always feel like anything, and because, of course, most people will experience somewhat unique feelings from all drugs, maybe the best way to put it, it kind of feels like it's about to feel like nothing. And then it does feel like nothing. Beautiful, blissful nothing. It's probably what I felt like for the billions of years before I existed, and probably what I'll feel like after I die. Eventually you pop back into reality, look at the clock, and try to figure out how long went by when you were out, and then get back to life. So what's it do, you've got to be thinking? Well, quite a bit actually. I already mentioned glutamate blockage. Ketamine also increases cerebral metabolism, cerebral blood flow, and intracranial blood pressure. Plus, like opioids, it also binds to the mu-opioid receptors. And of course, it binds to sigma-phencyclidine receptors, the same receptors where PCP works its magic. It does all of this really fast. Ketamine is highly lipid-soluble, which means it can permeate the blood-brain barrier and kick in 5 to 10 times faster than the infamous knockout drug sodium pentothal, and it wears off fast too. When taken orally, it has around a 25% bioavailability, which means 75% of what you take will never make it to your bloodstream. When snorted, it goes up to around 50%, but when taken intravenously, in slow, controlled doses, like at a doctor's office, it has 100% bioavailability, plus the added comfort of a safe supply. There's a lot more I could talk about regarding ketamine. I could go on all day, but 3 things seem kind of important to mention before I wrap this up. 1. So-called K-holes, which I mentioned earlier. There's no shortage of derogatory words used to put drug users in our place. And more importantly, to prevent our friends and family members from feeling guilty when they don't want to hang out with us when we've had a bad night. Knowing that a ketamine issue is probably related to the difference between anesthetic doses, like you might use for surgery, and therapeutic doses, like you use to get high, is usually enough to help you understand what's happening when someone's taken too much. It's pretty hard to overdose on ketamine, but it's still important to have people around you to help you if you think you might be close, or if you're freaking out. We now know that set and setting, Tim Leary's big thing, does indeed play a huge role in how we experience drugs. If you take rats who are dependent on large doses of morphine and give them steady doses every day, then move them one day to a new cage with nothing different except the color of the walls, many of them die from overdose when they take the normal amount, just because they were slightly uncomfortable at the color of the cage. The point is, if someone close to you is struggling with having taken too much ketamine or anything else, that's always a great time to make them comfortable and safe, and to keep an eye on them to make sure they don't need additional medical treatment. The war on drugs is so deadly in this regard, because it always encourages us to push our friends away when they need us most, and that makes tolerance go way down, increasing the risk of overdose. The second thing I want to cover before we go is opioid tolerance, specifically the claim that ketamine might reverse it. This is such a powerful promise that I've heard it deployed at least half a dozen times in the last decade by people peddling different cures. And at least once, those who used it on a radio commercial in Denver were sued out of existence, because there's no such thing as a rapid overnight detox from opioids that returns users to pre-use biochemistry. Well, actually, there kind of is, but it's nowhere near that simple or successful, and it's a different topic for a different day. But with ketamine, there are indeed some reports of this, although many of them are from people who are escalating their opioid doses in response to pain management needs, and they suddenly experience a rare response whereby opioids make the pain worse, not better. It's called hyperalgesia. I say rare, but one of my friends has it, so maybe it's not quite as rare as we think. I mean, if you took opioids and they made you feel worse, you would probably just tell your doctor they didn't work and throw them in the garbage before you ever took larger doses. So it's possible that many people who have it don't even know they have it. Anyway, it looks like for these folks, ketamine treatment might do the same thing that it does for those who use it in therapeutic settings to overcome PTSD. It allows them to sort of rewire their typical neural pathways, and instead of getting excited when opioids show up, they calm down and let them work. There's some older studies that seem to show that short, high doses of ketamine can reverse opioid tolerance completely in just a few days, but they haven't been replicated, and whatever effect the researchers saw was likely the same thing that happened in the final thing I want to talk about, the point of ketamine treatment. You might think it's weird that we've come this far and not hit on what the YouTube videos and the advertisements all promise. The, quote, rewiring of brain circuits and overcoming of depression and PTSD without years of therapy, which are typically required to achieve this. But if you decode those claims from their capitalistic packaging, what's really being promised is a summary of what I've already described. So let's go through it one more time, because that neurology stuff can indeed be confusing. Your excitatory neurons often use glutamate to fire, and they fire in two ways. One big, that's NMDA receptors, and one small, that's AMPA receptors. The small firing actually helps the large firing, but it also begins a process whereby more receptors for glutamate show up on the surface of that neuron, making it easier to fire it the next time, and easier once again the next. The more we play with a pathway, the more practice we get, and the more it turns from a thought into a memory. But with ketamine, the NMDA receptor is antagonized, which means it's blocked. Now you might think that that would greatly reduce the amount of glutamate in the synapse, but it doesn't, for a number of reasons which also don't quite fit with this episode. Glutamate is a hella cool neurotransmitter which appears to be the target of the next 50 years or so of antidepressant drugs. So I'm sure it'll come up again on this podcast. It's one of the only neurochemicals without a reuptake system because it metabolizes into its own greatest enemy, GABA. And even though it's an amino acid we need to survive, it isn't something we have to get from our food. It was so important that evolution just built in our own ability to synthesize it. So when NMDA receptor sites are blocked by ketamine or by PCP, instead of glutamate levels going down, they go way up. And that kicks off this process whereby all sorts of things start happening. Most notably, the process of calcium, that double positive charged ion, making its way into the neuron. And that calcium influx currently appears to be where the magic happens, or at least where it begins. Here's how this is worded in one journal article, which I've linked in the episode description for those that want to take a shot at the technical stuff. Quote, according to the hypothesis of disinhibition, blockage of NMDAR by ketamine should induce massive calcium entry through the glutamate-independent pathway and mobilization from intercellular stores, thus producing prolonged calcium dynamics and increased calcium in large population of neurons. End quote. See, I told you there was a language gap. What that means is two things. Number one, the neuron is probably going to fire because calcium has a double positive charge. And number two, a bunch of additional processes kick off involving a bunch of additional chemicals, which I won't even try to include in this episode because they really don't matter. The end result of the process is the additional AMPA receptors that show up on the synapse surface, but also a longer lasting neurogenesis effect whereby neurons basically reinforce their dendrites. That's the arm that reach out from a neuron towards others. They make those connections easier to make. That's the reason depression seems to rapidly decrease in the days and weeks following an injection. The byproducts of that calcium influx at just the right time basically make our neurons easier to fire and to connect. So we feel like we want to get out of bed and try something new, the opposite of depression. But what about PTSD? Well, here it gets a bit more complicated, and of course, we really don't know for sure what the final answer is on any of this, although we're getting pretty damn close with depression. So with PTSD, here's my best guess. When we sleep at night, we're supposed to go back through the day's memory and sort of compress them, throwing out the stuff that's not important and coding the stuff that is into long-term memories, which we then store in our cortex. Then, according to Dr. Matthew Walker, we use REM sleep to sort of test those memories out, and in the case of traumatic memories, to declaw them and make them more bearable, since they're going to be around for the rest of our lives. So REM sleep is the only time your brain doesn't have any adrenaline in it. None. Which means you can relive that event or memory, including various permutations, which we've all been freaked out about in our dreams. And instead of terror, you realize it's okay. Your fight or flight doesn't show up, so you get to at least live it all the way out and work through it. But when a memory is really awful, it wakes us up anyway, because it's so extreme that we override those sleep circuits with danger chemicals, including adrenaline, and the memory never gets processed. Sometimes it stays there, unprocessed for years, or even for the rest of our lives. I think ketamine's dreamlike state and partial disabling of glutamate's rapid response potential works to allow us to do something very similar to what we do when we dream, which is why, unlike MDMA therapy, you don't have to talk to a therapist while you're high on ketamine, yet the drug still seems to do the same work as psychotherapy. We just do it ourselves, in the dream state safety of our perfectly medicated K-holes. And once we work through those things, along with the neurogenesis and brain fuel effects we feel for weeks following these injections, we deal with what we haven't been able to deal with. It loses its sting. So that's ketamine in a super simplified Dr. Junkie format. I think this will be revisited in the future, considering how popular and how groundbreaking glutamate modulation drugs are, so stay tuned. For those who remember that Laura was going to come back and talk about her experience with ketamine, no worries, we're still going to do that someday. And maybe I'll even sign up for a round myself in the meantime and report back. Until then, love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce.
For me, I'm just speaking subjectively, it was a sort of empty space. It was a light-filled space, and the metaphor that came to me was, it's like a new skyscraper, and they don't have any tenants. So there are these endless hallways lit by fluorescent lights and wonderful water coolers every 300 feet, but there's nobody there. And I talked to Rupert about this because one of the things we've kicked around over the years is the idea that drugs are like morphogenetic fields. And so, for instance, when you take psilocybin, it takes you. And in a sense, you are participating in every psilocybin trip anybody ever had.